welcome back to the Land and Climate podcast. My name is Alasdair and this time I spoke to Peter Lehner about the impacts of US farming on our climate and environment. Peter is an environmental lawyer and previously having been the executive director of US NGO, the Natural Resources Defence Council, or NRDC, he's now managing attorney of the Sustainable Food and Farming Programme at NGO Earthjustice.
You can't fix anything if you don't know. And most people don't know that agriculture in the US is the biggest driver of biodiversity loss. It's the biggest driver of water pollution. It's one of the biggest drivers of air pollution. It's one of the biggest drivers of climate change. It's one of the biggest drivers of poor public health. And if you don't know that, if the public doesn't know that, then there's no pressure for policy change.
I began by asking Peter to explain why agriculture was so important for climate change.
One of the challenges we have when talking about policy for agriculture is that most people don't understand that agriculture drives about a quarter to a third or more of climate change. When they think about climate change, they think about burning fossil fuels in a power plant or in a car or truck and releasing carbon dioxide. And there is some of that in agriculture. You think about farm tractors actually burn quite a lot of energy or electricity for irrigation systems or ventilation fans at animal houses. But most of agriculture's contribution to climate change is not from burning fossil fuels. It's from either nitrous oxide or methane or lost carbon from the soil. So nitrous oxide, where does that come from? That's a very potent greenhouse gas, about 300 times more powerful for climate change than carbon dioxide. And it largely comes because farmers in the US, where I focus, and around the world, put too much fertilizer on their land. And the fertilizer that isn't taken up by a plant doesn't evaporate, doesn't vanish. It either goes into the water and causes water pollution or goes up into the atmosphere, often as nitrous oxide, this powerful greenhouse gas and ozone depleter. The other big driver is methane. And you've probably heard of methane from the oil and gas system. Actually, in the United States at least, cows and the agriculture system are a larger source of methane than the oil and gas system. And that's because cows are just all the time, when they exhale, they breathe out methane. Their guts are different than yours and mine. That's why they can eat grass and you and I can't. But that means they're belching methane all the time. And all of those animals, there's billions of animals just in the United States alone, and they produce a vast amount of waste. A dairy cow, for example, will produce as much as 200 people. And we carefully treat human waste. But largely, animal waste is not treated. It's just either left on the ground or put in these big pits where it just festers for a while, releasing wet methane, and then is put on fields. And then the last way agriculture contributes to climate change is because when you think about healthy soils in native grasslands or forests, there's a lot of carbon stored there. When you convert that to agriculture, all of that carbon that is in those trees and in the soil mixes with oxygen in the air and becomes carbon dioxide. And that soil is pretty close to dead from a carbon perspective. And so it is no longer able to sequester carbon the way healthy soils can. So agriculture, through nitrous oxide, through methane, through lost soil carbon, and many other drivers because it uses so much land, is a huge contributor to climate change, but a different one than fossil fuels. And the result is that unless we change our agriculture system, we will not achieve climate stability.
Given that you're working on US agriculture, can you explain to us a little bit about why US agriculture is important in terms of its influence and how it might affect agriculture elsewhere and emissions elsewhere?
Sure, for a number of reasons. One is it's big. So just in terms of global emissions, anything that happens in the U.S. is important from a global scale. Another is that the food system is very, very interconnected. In the U.S., for example, we import and export about 15 or 20% of our food. What we do in the United States affects what happens in other countries. We can undercut other countries. For example, Mexico right now is saying, hey, you're subsidizing your corn, you're selling it cheap into Mexico, so you're destroying the ability of farmers in Mexico to grow corn at a reasonable and get a reasonable price for it. So we can undercut producers in other countries. We can also create markets for producers. Right now, for example, the U.S., there's a battle about importing beef from Paraguay. If it weren't for the market in the United States, what Paraguay would do would be very, very different. There's not only so many people in Paraguay. U.S. is a huge market. So we can undercut what happens there. We can also create markets there. It's also technology. A lot of the farming technology is first developed in the U.S. and then is exported abroad, either directly or has to be adopted abroad because they have to compete with the U.S. And it's not just technology like tractor, it is the whole system. So, for example, the way we have shifted our production of animals, which used to be outside and eating what was on the ground. And now they're in houses, food is brought to them, and they never get to move. For pigs often are in these tiny areas and barely move. You've seen probably pictures of thousands, tens of thousands of chickens crammed in and can barely move. That's how we raise virtually all of our animals in the United States, and that system is being exported into other countries. So the U.S. really has both direct economic impact and systems impact abroad. Much of that, unfortunately, has not been great. It could be a force for good. And I should say one last way, a big impact, is the diet. The U.S. diet is expanding around the world, and you go into other countries which used to have a more fruit and vegetable type of diet of local foods, and they are now shifting to higher sugar, higher calorie, lower fiber fast foods, etc. And you see rates of diabetes increase, rates of heart disease increase, but our diet is dramatically being exported and changing what people eat as well. And so when that happens, it changes what people grow.
Maybe we could go now into the US Farm Bill, which is something that I know you wanted to talk about, but which is, I think, ongoing in Congress. And maybe also explain to listeners why that's significant. And maybe that helps anchor this discussion around US agriculture and its importance.
I like to say the Farm Bill is the most important environmental bill people have never heard of. People in the United States think about the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and laws like that. And those laws are wonderful and have been models for other countries. But the Farm Bill actually has a tremendous impact on what is grown, where it's grown, how it's grown. 62% of the contiguous U.S. is agriculture. So most of land use is governed by agriculture. And so the Farm Bill very significantly affects what happens on almost 2/3 of American land. And that is something that is rarely understood. So the Farm Bill started in the United States in about 1933 in the Depression and the Dust Bowl. And you had the twin challenges of food security, people were going hungry, and farm security, the farm system collapsed. So Congress stepped in and said we need essentially a food safety net and a farm safety net. And in the big scope of things, that's still the structure. The Farm Bill has one section on nutrition. That often gets about 3/4 of the money. And that is very important. It provides food for 45 million Americans. Super important. And then you have the other sections which are providing subsidies to farmers, about $20 billion a year of subsidies to farmers. And how those subsidies are shaped makes a big impact on what farmers grow, where they grow it, how they grow it. There's, for example, very heavily subsidized crop insurance. We certainly need crop insurance. We want to have food, and sometimes bad weather happens, and we all want to make sure our farms survive. But when it's very, very heavily subsidized and takes no account of the behavior of farmers, you essentially incentivize risky behavior. Think about, when you're driving, you get a discount if you take a defensive driving course, or if you have a fire alarm, you get a discount on your home insurance. We do the opposite in crop insurance. We do very little to incentivize risk mitigating behavior. And that could be changed, but right now that's our challenge. There's also conservation payments. We pay farmers to do good things. But it turns out that many of those supposedly good things, the government itself has figured out actually aren't that good for the environment. We can better target those conservation payments for the most important practices that will have the biggest impact in reducing climate change.
Back to what you mentioned about crop insurance, I suppose. Can you just go into a little bit more detail about that? Because I do think that's interesting. So crop insurance is kind of creating perverse incentives or risky incentives around what farmers are using more monocrops, or are they planting one thing, or how's that working out?
So farmers think ahead and think, okay, I want a little bit of diversity. I want to plant in ways and in places that might be great in good years, but also won't cost me a huge amount if it's not a good year. But if crop insurance is very heavily subsidized, there's an incentive to plant in land that is marginal. And that's often ecologically the most important land. And if everything goes right, the planting in marginal land works out and the farmer does great. But it often doesn't work out just perfectly, but the taxpayer essentially picks up the tab in that case. You also have incentives for overproduction because this crop insurance is not just weather dependent. It's not just your yield, but also if the price goes down. And again, part of what farmers normally will think about, what anyone in a market thinks about, is supply and demand, and that affects price. But if you're insulated from that, you just keep producing more and more, which is what the system is designed to do, but it means we end up having to support that price more. So in the United States, for example, we have close to 90 million acres of corn and another 90 million acres of soybeans. Both of those, corn is very, very heavily subsidized. And when you have very heavily fertilized monocultures that also require a lot of pesticides, you get a lot of water pollution, you get soil that is devoid of carbon, and you get a lot of greenhouse gas impact. So thinking about crop insurance, the way we think about, frankly, every other type of insurance in our life, we could have a big environmental impact.
Is there any prospect of reform on crop insurance?
There's a lot of conversation about that. I think this year is a funny year. The Farm Bill is unlike every other law, or almost every other law. It has to be reauthorized every 5 years. It was supposed to be amended in 2023. Congress couldn't get their act together, so they extended it for 1 year to September 2024. The folks I work with down in Washington are not that optimistic that we're going to get a farm bill through in 2024, and it may get pushed to after the election in 2024. It may get pushed to 2025. Who knows? But I think the reality of major change in this farm bill is pretty modest. Given the politics, most likely we will get a farm bill that is not wildly dissimilar from the current 2018 farm bill. I think there's going to be a little more climate attention, which is good, following the Inflation Reduction Act, which some of your listeners may have heard of, this huge bill in the United States. And most people know about it because of the billions and billions of dollars going to clean energy, clean transportation. They may not know that also $20 billion went to clean farming, to practices that would reduce greenhouse gas emissions from farming. So that's a good precedent. And so we'll hope to get a little more climate attention in this farm bill. I think the Democrats are definitely pushing hard for more equity provisions. The U.S. has a terrible history of discrimination in its administration of all these farm programs. And so they're trying to make some fixes to that. Whether or not that gets through this Congress, who knows? But I don't think we're going to see dramatic changes in this farm bill.
Going back to 2018, and you've been working in agriculture for a long time. I mean, were there similar attempts to turn the Farm Bill into something more environmentally and climate friendly in 2018? Or is there been more of a realization that now the Farm Bill needs to have more work on it?
In 2018, we were told never to mention climate change because at that time, for example, the American Farm Bureau Federation, which is in many ways the most powerful lobby for the industrial agriculture system, wasn't accepting the reality of human-caused climate change. That's in 2018, only a few years ago. Fortunately, they now accept that. But in 2018, the bill is about 850 pages long, no mention of greenhouse gases or climate change. We are way ahead of where we were in 2018 in that at least everyone recognizes that climate change is real and that agriculture contributes to climate change, which is not the case in 2018, but we still have a long, long way to go.
Some people say that the US is kind of politically quite behind on climate environment, yet some of the things that you've been working on are probably more positive in agriculture in other countries. Is that fair?
I think that is fair. And yeah, I was the executive director of NRDC, and we work some in Europe and also in China and India and Latin America. And we had the ability in energy issues to think about technology transfer, to take the advances that the U.S. had in energy efficiency and clean energy systems and encourage that and accelerate the adoption of clean and efficient energy in other countries. As agriculture, our system is certainly not advanced like that. In some ways, I should say, technology, it may be. For example, drone technology or precision agriculture, using GPS guides on your tractors to apply just the right amount of fertilizer. Very important issues. And certainly there's efforts on breeding of cows to perhaps belch a little less methane or be a little more productive. So in that technology way, the U.S. is certainly one of the leading countries. But what's happened is U.S. research in agriculture has declined. Public research has declined, where in other countries it's increased. And it's been replaced by private research in agriculture. And private research is not focusing on sustainability. It's focusing on, frankly, things that can be patented and sold. So a lot of that research is going into new pesticides or new seeds that are linked to new pesticides, these Roundup Ready or dicamba resistant seeds, which put you on this sort of treadmill or this arms race of pesticides and weeds that is turning out to be an ecological and human health disaster. But also our system is, I think, behind the times. Other countries are really talking about both the food and agriculture together. And in the U.S., in a almost bizarre way, we separate the two. And important writers like Michael Pollan and Mark Bittman and others have talked about that we have a farm support system that really doesn't think about the food we produce. So we're not producing and subsidizing healthy foods. Other countries are often subsidizing fruits and vegetables, healthier foods more. We are producing these commodity grains and animal agriculture to a huge extent. The part of the reason the American diet is so heavy in meat is because it is very, very heavily subsidized. So it's very cheap comparatively. The real price of meat is largely borne by the taxpayer. So in that sense, other countries are way ahead of the U.S.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, you may be paying attention to what's going on in farming in Europe, for example, as well, in terms of in the last year or so, there's been a little bit of a backlash against what has been an attempt, kind of environmental climate reforms to agriculture, you know, in the Common Agricultural Policy, the Food to Farm policies. What do you make of that from a US perspective, if you can say something on that? And also, do you think anything in a similar manner could happen in the US?
The challenge is it's so interconnected. We really can't just tweak one element. We have a food system that is highly, highly concentrated. You had a great podcast recently with Austin Frerich, who wrote a book on consolidation in the U.S. agriculture system. And part of the result of that is that there are some in the food system, like Tyson's and Cargill, the ones who are at the top, that are making tons of money. But the farmers themselves, the folks who are actually raising the food, are often not getting that much money. The landowners, if you're a landowner, you may make a lot of money. All these subsidies will help you. But in the U.S., half of land is rented to other people, often owned by non-farmers. And we also have a history for 50 years of agriculture largely being exempt from environmental laws. So, for example, these big animal factories that I mentioned, where you are generating tremendous amounts of methane, they are the largest source of methane. They're also some of the largest sources of hydrogen sulfide and ammonia, two poisonous gases. And yet they're exempt from most clean air rules. If they were factories producing chairs or cars or something else, there would be rules saying, hey, you've got to limit your pollution. And those rules would have been around for the last 50 years. So part of what's happening is when in Europe, for example, when they're beginning to say, hey, agriculture, the industrial part of agriculture at least, has to address its pollution the way other sectors of the economy do, and the way other sectors of the economy have been doing for 30 and 50 years, they're saying, whoa, whoa, whoa. So they're not used to it. And also, because of this consolidation, the farmer itself, him or herself, at the sort of the low end of the production system, a lot of the cost will get dumped on them, but in the current system, a lot of the profit goes to other people, other parts of the system. And that's what they're objecting to. So you really have to look at, if you want to crack down, as we do, on agricultural pollution, you also have to look at the sort of the economic system and where the money is, and realize that the money is at the Tyson, Purdue, JBS level, not at the producer. So we have to figure out how to address that. And that's why, for example, the Biden administration has been trying to address some of these consolidation issues, why different in the EU and the US and perhaps elsewhere, they're looking at antitrust a little more aggressively than they used to, because you can't just fix one little bit of the system without thinking about the whole system. That said, an important first step for us in the United States is simply transparency. You can't fix anything if you don't know. And most people don't know that agriculture in the U.S. is the biggest driver of biodiversity loss. It's the biggest driver of water pollution. It's one of the biggest drivers of air pollution. It's one of the biggest drivers of climate change. It's one of the biggest drivers of poor public health. And if you don't know that, if the public doesn't know that, then there's no pressure for policy change. And policymakers aren't feeling any pressure that we have to really rethink our agriculture system in a way to produce healthy food sustainably. They think, no problem. I'm not hearing any noise about that. So it's really important, and it's so grateful for podcasts like this, for people to begin to understand, if we want climate stability, if we want biodiversity, if we want clean air, if we want clean water, we need to have a agriculture system that is supporting that. Whereas now our industrial agriculture system and the policies that support it are doing just the opposite.
I just wondered if you could say something about the kind of the legal approaches that big agrochemical companies have had, and how you view that, from your perspective. Is it and how can that be fought against?
It's partly the way the agrochemical companies are using the existing laws and the existing political system. So the pesticides, for example, in the United States are largely regulated by EPA under a statute that requires EPA to register pesticides. And unfortunately, sort of one by one, from a regulatory perspective, you can get to sort of whack-a-mole where the environmental community or public health advocates may say, hey, we have concern about this pesticide, and maybe EPA does something about it 10 years too late, but maybe late better than never. But then people just use a different pesticide, and that doesn't necessarily help public health as much as it could. So one of the things that we would like to see is more of a systemic approach. Why, and I can see this on the farms that I manage, it's not a question of which pesticide, it's how do you think about pests, whether it be weeds or bugs. And you've really got to rethink that. And so the typical term is integrated pest management. So instead of saying you just do something regularly, I'm going to spray every 2 weeks, you maybe monitor super carefully. You try to have good plants and bad plants. Plants that are at risk, maybe there's some good bugs that will be nearby that like some other plants. So you can plant those other plants nearby, attract the good bugs that eat the bad bugs. And maybe you'll still need a little bit of pesticide, but not nearly as much. If you rotate crops, a bug that, for example, loves corn and only corn, if you doesn't have corn for another 3 or 4 years because you're rotating your crops, there's not going to be very much of that bug. On the other hand, if you plant corn every year, there's just more and more of that, and you have to do more and more. So one issue is we would say we really want to encourage this integrated pest management type of system thinking. The agrochemical industry doesn't like that. They want you to just throw on a lot more pesticides. So unfortunately, that thinking has really not been advanced as much as it could. And in fact, much of the agrochemical companies, their research has gone into, for example, seeds that are resistant to certain pesticides. And we all know about Roundup Ready seeds. And it turns out that weeds got used to Roundup. And then we added dicamba to the Roundup. And now weeds are used to that. And now we're adding 2,4-D. And now weeds are getting used to that. And it's really this insane arms race. I remember one time I mistakenly bought some pesticide, some weed killer at the local store, and I sprayed it on something, and it was like the next day that thing was vanished. Some of these things are so powerful, and then I looked and said, whoa, that's 2,4-D. Man, I'm never using that again. These are very powerful chemicals that they're focusing on. And as we all know, you don't win an arms race. You have to really change the paradigm. What is unfortunate, in addition to the specifics, like Monsanto lobbying states to make sure that people can't bring cases for Monsanto's failure to warn people about Roundup. As you may know, there's a bunch of lawsuits like that in the United States. Bayer Monsanto has been losing them. So what are they doing? They're trying to use their political power to go to the states to make sure those lawsuits are preempted. But there's also this larger way that the chemical companies are really slowing a transition to a systems thinking and integrated pest management thinking, which would be so critical. And by the way, from my own experience, it's much better from a farmer perspective. You spend pesticides and fertilizers are enormously expensive. They're a big part of the budget running a farm. And if you can spend less money on that, you're going to probably be more profitable.
You know, this is an election year. There's a possibility that there will be a Trump presidency. Is there any preparation for this amongst US NGOs? Is there any excitement about it, or maybe reticence? How is this being viewed? And do you think it could mean a reverse of environmental climate progress of the last few years?
First, let me say I work at a 501c3 non-political organization, so I'm not going to make any political commentary. I think the Trump campaign has certainly campaigned on reversing environmental protections from the Biden administration. So it's not a surprise or a political statement to say that what we can expect that. It's also a fact that Trump got a lot of his support before from rural areas. That is where a lot of agriculture takes place. So we can certainly expect, as before, policies that are essentially more favorable to conventional agriculture as it is now, rather than seeing the opportunities for making a healthier, more sustainable, and frankly, in the long run, more profitable farm system. I think what is often lost is that there is a fair amount of money in the food system. But a lot of it, as I mentioned earlier, is going to either maybe at the retail level or at the producer level, the Tysons, the JBS, the Cargills, the Purdue's, the ones who control the animals that want to buy cheap food. And they want to actually not have to pay too much to the people who are taking care of the animals. So what we think of as the farmer, the people growing the crops and growing the animals, are the ones that the big companies that control the system don't want to pay very much to. So I think what's often a challenge in politics is not understanding that the food system has these different levels, and listening to the big agrochemical companies or the meat integrators as if they are speaking for the actual farm producer, the farm laborer, the farm worker, which they don't.
Thanks very much to Peter Lehner for his time. There's a list of further recommended reading around issues brought up in this episode on our podcast blurb, and do also check out our Land and Climate website for other stories we've published. Thanks to Vasko Kostovski for producing this episode, and we'll be back again in a few weeks' time. Thanks for listening.